draft legislation covering non-arm's length expenditure relating to general expenses for SMSFs has just been released, confirming the government's position in the budget on this matter. Peter Burgess from the SMSF Association is with me today to discuss this development. Hello, Peter.
G'day, Darren. Pleasure to be here.
It's great to be speaking with you again. I think we'll start just by confirming what is the calculation of the penalty the government has landed on.
Yeah, so Darren, as they announced in the budget and was confirmed in the draft legislation that's now been released, for general expenses that have been incurred on a non-arm's length basis, it's 2 times the shortfall amount. So what I mean by that, it's the difference between what the fund did pay and what the fund should have paid if it was on an arm's length basis. So the shortfall amount. So 2 times the shortfall amount will need to be included as non-arm's length income. So the fund pays tax on that amount as non-arm's length income. So that's what was announced on budget night. That's what we've seen announced in the draft legislation as well. So we were talking, just about general expenses here because they're not making any changes to the current law around specific expenses, but this is general expenses we're talking here. And of course, for larger funds, they will be exempted from these non-arm's length expense provisions. The 2019 amendments, they'll be exempted from those provisions across the board.
Right, Peter. I think on budget night, there was pretty much agreement that that's a slight victory compared to what was originally proposed. But having said that, what's the association's preferred position on the non-arm's length expenditure rules?
Yeah, no, you are right, Darren. It's certainly a better position than what we've got in the current laws. So, 2 times the shortfall amount is much better than having to pay non-arm's length income on all the income that relates to that new non-arm's length expense. So certainly a better an outcome. But, look, it wasn't the outcome we were hoping for, and it certainly wasn't the outcome that we had been advocating for. We were hoping to see SMSFs carved out just like large funds. So not just large funds being exempted from these provisions, but self-managed super funds as well. So across the board, it is certainly our view that the mischief that these provisions were intended to address, the amendments that were made back in 2019 to address this mischief, that it's already been addressed. When you think about the safe harbour parameters that's been, were released by the ATO some years ago now, that was designed to address the mischief with non-arm's length LRBAs and zero interest rate loans and things. And so that has been addressed. And that, really was the reason that these amendments were put in place in the first place. And also the contribution ruling that we've seen released by the ATO as well addresses this issue where situations where the fund does pay less than it should have on an arm's length basis. So, in our view, the existing legislation already deals with this. There was no need for the 2019 amendments. It's still unclear to us as to why we need these amendments. So our position remains that not just large funds, but self-managed super funds should also be exempted from these provisions. So in other words, the 2019 amendment should be repealed.
Okay, now, of course, we have to acknowledge that the draft legislation includes a consultation period which ends on the 7th of July, I believe. Are you confident that this consultation process may result in a better outcome?
Look, we hope so, Darren. We will still continue to advocate for a complete, repeal of these provisions for all funds, not just large funds. We've been having these discussions now for some time, for a couple of years now, in fact, with the government and Treasury. I'm not overly confident that we are going to see the government change their mind on the 2 times, but we will be having our say in the consultation phase around the specific expense issue, which has not been addressed to date. So the announcements that came out on budget night and the draft legislation does not address some of the very significant issues that we still have with the way these 2019 amendments apply to specific expenses. So we'll be having our say on that. We firmly believe that trustees in appropriate circumstances should have rights to fix the issue, so powers to remediate. the issue. They don't have that under the current law, and that does give rise to some, very unfair outcomes. I think one of the examples that was in the ATO's ruling around Tran, the plumber, which has been spoken about quite a bit, particularly in our meetings with Treasury and Government. If you look at that example in that ruling, they made some capital improvements to a property, and they didn't pay an arm's length expense for that. So that asset is forever tainted now as non-arm's length income. So when it's eventually sold, the capital gain will be subjected to non-arm's length income. So, we think there are circumstances where that is very unfair. We think the trustees should have the ability to rectify the situation. So that's what we'll be putting forward in this next round of consultation.
Now, speaking of unfair, let's move on to the $3 million soft cap, which is still causing a lot of angst amongst the SMSF community. Has there been any indication that this policy might be amended, or are there any recent developments that might see any sort of change that we might expect?
Oh, look, we certainly don't expect the government to move away from the $3 million cap. We think that certainly they'll proceed with that. We still remain hopeful that they will change the way they're planning on calculating earnings for this new tax. We think taxing unrealized gains is not an equitable way, not a fair way to calculate earnings for the purpose of this new tax. We understand they're looking for the same approach that can apply to all funds, but it is simply not an equitable approach what they're proposing. We are firmly of the view that there is an alternative. There is a better, simpler, and certainly more fairer approach when it comes to calculating earnings for the purpose of this new tax, and that is to base it on actual taxable earnings that apply to each member of the fund. Now, it's not difficult for self-managed super funds to report that information to the ATO. We understand for some of the larger funds it is difficult for them to do that, but why should the SMSF sector be penalised because the large funds are not able to provide that information, or some large funds? We think to apply a notional earning rate for those funds that can't report that actual information, and for those funds that can report actual taxable earnings for individual members, that should be based on that. We think that is the fairest and I would argue the simplest approach, to be honest. We remain hopeful that we will see some changes to the way the government is planning on calculated earnings, because the current approach, I think, is not equitable, and I would argue not simple. There are going to be a number of adjustments that they're going to need to make to the total super balance calculation to ensure the movement in someone's total super balance does not give rise to a higher amount of earnings, doesn't overstate earnings for the purpose of this new tax.
Well, fingers crossed we might see some sensible amendments to that policy in the near future. Now we're heading into July, and that means that the SMSF Association Technical Summit for 2023 is approaching. And no doubt these two issues will be discussed at great length during that event. Is that going to be the case?
Yeah, absolutely, Dara. There's been a lot happening on the legislation front, so there is plenty to discuss at our technical summit this year. So no doubt the $3 million cap there's a number of sessions talking about that. The changes to the NALE rules will also be discussed. There's been plenty going on, so I can tell you for my opening legislation update session, there's no shortage of content that I've got to work with. So I'll be certainly covering quite a lot, and the other sessions as well will be covering those aspects in some detail. It is a very technical conference. It's a conference that has been designed for specialist members, for experienced professionals. It's an outstanding lineup of speakers. I know I say this every year, but the lineup does, I think, get stronger every year. So Meg will be there. We'll have Craig Day, Mark Allen, Bryce will be speaking, of course, Gemma Sanderson. It's a really impressive lineup of speakers. And there'll be 6 technical workshops. So I think this event is different to our national conference. This is a more intimate event. It's not as big as our national conference. There is a higher proportion of workshops. So we'll be providing 6 technical workshops over 2 days. They will be using case studies, really getting into the detail. So it's going to be a great event. I'm really looking forward to it. And of course, this time around, we have our gala dinner. It is our 20-year anniversary. So at the end of the first day of the conference, we will be holding our 20-year gala dinner. And we've got some special things planned for that evening. So it should be a really good event.
That sounds fantastic. Thank you for sharing that with us, Peter.
Pleasure.
The SMSF Association Technical Summit 2023 will be held at the Star on the Gold Coast across the 26th and the 27th of July. To register for the event, please reference the details you can see on the screen now. Look, thanks again for your time today, Peter. It was a pleasure talking to you, and I can't wait to see you on the Gold Coast in a few weeks' time, and I will definitely be in the audience for that first session that you just spoke about.
That's great, Darren. Looking forward to seeing you there.